Hi, and welcome to the board wrap-up for January 2014. The Ponca City Board of Education met recently, and a number of things occurred, including the hiring of a new board member for our Ponca City Board of Education. And so we're going to start with our superintendent, Dr. David Pennington. You had 3 qualified people that wanted the Ward 5 position, and if you could kind of go through what happened.
Well, we had a meeting last night, and at 5 o'clock, where we had the 3 candidates for the board came and answered questions from the members of the Board of Education, and then the board went into executive session, and they came out and they selected Marvin Clark to fill that spot on Ward 5. We did have good candidates. We had individuals with experience in construction, which we do a lot of building in this district. So obviously, somebody with that kind of background would have been a positive for the board. We had an individual with who has grandchildren in our school that's volunteered at Lincoln. That would have been a great addition to our board. And then we had Mr. Clark, and I think that the board, I've not talked to the board members about, why they made the decision they did, but as somebody who sat and listened to the interviews, while we had lots of good people, from my perspective, there was just no doubt that Marvin was the best qualified because Marvin's been on our board before. Marvin served on the board for 11 years from Ward 5, and so he's represented that part of town before. As a superintendent, the reason I was happy that they selected Marvin is that he already knows, he knows the process. He knows school finance. He knows how the legislature works. He knows how the Board of Education works. So he doesn't have to be trained. He's ready to step in and go to work right away. So I thought that was a real positive, especially when you're talking about a position that you're just appointing somebody to serve for 1 year. We could have, again, if we'd appointed someone else, it's a very real possibility they might have decided not to run in December, and so we're back again next fall or next spring, having to training 2 people in less than a year. Or they could have ran and they could have not won an election. So at least with Marvin, we've got somebody who knows how the process works, and I think has been involved in our booster clubs. He's been very involved in the music program over the years, and so I think obviously is somebody that's well respected in the community. So I think that's a great bonus for us. I don't anticipate that Marvin will run. I think he saw this as there's obviously there's a hole here. We need somebody to come in for a year, so for him it was just a chance to come in and help stabilize things until somebody can run for that position and then serve a 2-year term, and that's what makes it hard. And that's what makes all this hard. When somebody's appointed and they can run and serve for 3 years or 4 years, I think individuals are more likely to do that. When you get down to going through an election, and I'm going to go through the process of running an election, which is not a fun thing to do, and to just do it for 2 years, I think that makes people hesitate.
You were a little concerned publicly about getting some candidates and having enough to have a choice in that ward. So to get 3 people that you felt were qualified enough to take to that interview, there's some interest there, and obviously when it comes up to another vote, right. Certainly we should have some more people involved in it.
You would hope that you would, but the thing I've learned over the years is that it's one thing to be appointed to the board, it's something else to run. And there are that prospect of having to file for election, having to pay the fee to file for an election, discourages a lot of people. But we were happy. We advertised in the newspaper. I sent a letter to every home with every child in Garfield and Lincoln School, trying. What I really was hoping for, Phil, is that we would have somebody that had a child in the school system seek that board position. We have a great board, and I wouldn't trade any of them. But I think that If there's anything that's lacking, is that we don't have any board members that currently have children in our schools. Now, they have all had children in our schools at one time. And some of them have grandchildren in our schools. And I think that's a real positive. But I just think that, you know, again, if I were king for a day and I were hand-picking a 5-member board, I would make sure that at least I had at least one board member who had children in our school system.
Clear up one thing, because I did have this question asked. A lot of people think that you pick a board member in this situation, but from what you're telling me, the board actually selects the new board member?
No, the board selects them. I don't. I didn't participate in the discussions last night.
Interesting.
No, that's their decision. Now, typically what will happen, and 2 of the 3 candidates did come in and speak to me beforehand, and just kind of as an introduction, so that gives you an opportunity to kind of see why people are running for the board. Obviously, you know, if you know, because there are some misconceptions. You know, there are some people that they think, well, I'm going to run for the board and I'm going to do A, B, C, or D. I think the first thing to always remember is that you're only a board member when the board meets. Board members do not hire and fire people. The board accepts and rejects recommendations on employment. In other words, if I recommend that somebody be hired for a position, the board can reject that, but the board doesn't then go out and select their own person. The only person that the board hires without input is the superintendent. And the same thing with terminating employment. We haven't had that here, but I've been in other districts where you had somebody who wanted to serve on the school board because they wanted to fire a teacher, they wanted to fire a principal, they wanted to fire the football coach, and you know, having to explain to them, well, you don't get to do that. What you get to do is to approve my recommendation. Now, you can reject my recommendation to employ someone, but you know, if the board were to do that without a recommendation from an administrator that this person needs not to be employed, boy, you've got lots of legal issues then. You have to remember that the board is, when it comes to employment, especially when it comes to termination, the board has to be neutral. They have to be able, because everybody has a right to appeal, to ask for a hearing before the board. And so that person can't have a fair hearing if the board members have made up their mind before the hearing takes place. So a board member who would advocate for the firing of an employee could not sit in judge of that employee. It would not be fair to that employee. And so when a lot of people hear those kinds of things, they say, well, I really don't want to do that. And I think that's the great thing about the 3 candidates we had yesterday, is none of those candidates had an agenda. They just wanted to serve this community, and I think they all deserve a pat on the back for stepping up and doing that.
Congratulations to Marvin Clark, who will be the Ward 5 representative. You also talked about something you've addressed several times, but last night you wanted to talk about state aid for Ponca City Public Schools as well.
Well, last night we talked about state aid, and I think that always want to start with the positive. And the positive is that in the midterm adjustment, and kind of to refresh our viewers' memories, funding for schools is a multiple step process. We get an initial allocation in July, and that tells us, is a starting point for our budget and how much money we're going to have for the next school year. That allocation gets revised in December, and what happens in the interim is 2 things happen. First, all of what we call chargeables, and those are dollars that are charged against state aid. So that's ad valorem collections, it's gross production taxes, it's motor vehicle taxes, that the portion of gross production of motor vehicle that comes to school district, it's REA taxes. Those we have the final collections for that for the previous year. All right, so all that comes in the fall, and then we also have if there's any change in your enrollment from the end of May till the 1st of October. If your enrollment goes up, you're entitled to more money. If your enrollment goes up and your chargeables go down, you're entitled to more money. If your chargeables were to go down, you're entitled to more money. Now, if your chargeables went up, let's say in the summer that they projected your chargeables were going to be $1 million, but instead you collected $2 million, well, then you would get less state aid the next year or in December because you don't need it because you have more local money to supplement the state money that you'd receive. And so the bottom line for us is that our state aid increased by $275,000. That is great news, and it's really the first real state aid increase we've had since 2010, 2011. And that was the last school year that we still were getting federal money to get us through the recession. So that really was good news. Now, there's bad news. And the bad news is this, is that when state aid is figured, you have what we call factors. And really those are just multipliers, that you take the number of kids you have, number of students, or weighted ADM, and you multiply that by a factor. We have a formula. The formula has a top part and the bottom part. It's kind of like algebra, I guess. And the factor at the top, we lost money. I think $6 a student. At the bottom, I think we went up maybe 10 cents over what we were in June. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is this: is that when the state put more money into the funding formula last year, which the state legislature appropriated $45 million, that wasn't enough money to cover the increase in the number of students that we have. So once again, public education lost money because not only did we not get enough money to increase what we're spending on students, we didn't get enough money to spend more on our kids, we didn't get enough money to stay even. So the amount of dollars that's available to support students across the state of Oklahoma for the fourth year in a row is less than what it was the year before. So earlier this year when I said that we had taken the highest percentage cut in student support, student funding in the country, and it was 22%, well, that's now more than 22%. Now, whether it's 23% or 22.5%, that's not being calculated out. But again, we have less dollars available to support students in our schools than we had before the recession hit. And then we went through and looked at a lot of things. I think, and this is for us, the really eye-opening thing yesterday. Last night what I did is I took those factors, those are the multipliers that we used in 2008, 2009, and I applied them to this year's formula. So if we were getting the same level of financial support from the state on a per student basis that we got in 2008, 2009, what would our state aid be? Well, we would have $2 million more in this school district than we have today. That's how much of a hit we have taken in funding in Ponca City and across the state of Oklahoma. I mean, that, everybody's numbers would be different because everybody has different enrollment and everybody's circumstances are different. But that's the amount of state aid that we've lost. Now, so that's $2 million that we don't have to spend on more teachers to lower our class sizes, teacher and support salary increases, maybe additional staff to help with some problem areas. Maybe, I don't know what that additional staff would be because we don't have any money. We don't think that way. But that's money that we don't have. And, it's just disappointing that the legislature has decided that there are other things in Oklahoma that are more important than our children. And I know that nobody in the legislature would say that's what they've done, and I don't think they consciously did. I mean, I don't think anybody in the legislature sat down one day and said, you know, I think that we ought to purposely take money away from public schools and spend it on something else. But the reality is that's what's happened. And so, you know, I think we have an obligation, those of us who are committed to public education, we have an obligation to make sure that our members of the legislature and state government understand that, you know, this is not acceptable. Now, I don't know if that's the majority or minority opinion in Oklahoma. It may be that the people in this state think that's a good idea, that we're not supporting public education at the level we did 5 or 6 years ago. I don't know, but we have to at least make the case and make the argument so that people can weigh in on both sides, and then the people who are elected to represent us can draw their own conclusions over what it is the people in Oklahoma want.
Does this debate begin all over again with the legislature beginning in a couple of weeks? Does this process of appropriations, lack therefor, does this all begin again?
Well, it does and it doesn't. And I think that's the thing, that one of the things I talked to the board about last night. It's interesting. There was an article in the Tulsa paper on Sunday in the second section of the paper, and the headline was, I can't remember exactly, but funds being skimmed from the state budget. You know, when you first read of that, you think there's some kind of criminal activity going on. But what the article basically said is we've gotten into a practice in the last several years at the legislature where there are certain entities that are getting money placed in their programs before it goes through the appropriation process. Some of that is stuff that I like. For example, each year there's $200 million of state revenue that off the top goes into the teacher retirement system. For years, the legislature neglected teacher retirement. The teachers put in what they should have been putting in. The school districts put in what they should have been putting into the system, but the legislature didn't make the contribution they should have made. And that's one reason why when you read about teacher retirement being unfunded or underfunded, that's the reason why. Now, we've made great progress. We've made some changes in the law. We've made some changes in retirement benefits. But one thing that's helped is every year for the last several years, $200 million outside of the appropriation process has gone to teacher retirement. And there's some money that goes into the Oklahoma Promise Scholarship, which is a scholarship that if students meet certain criteria, their tuition will be paid for 4 years at an Oklahoma institution of higher learning. Great program, but that money doesn't go through the appropriation process. Okay, the Oklahoma Promise and the teacher retirement money have not changed. Those figures have been the same for about the last 4 years. The one that's changed the most, and the one that was the focus of the article in the Tulsa paper, is money for transportation. And there's always a reason why things happen. Most of us remember when Hurricane Katrina hit, and some of us may remember that right at the same time that we had Katrina, which, if you remember, shut down the refineries along the Gulf Coast, which caused the price of oil or price of gasoline to go from about, was it $2.50 a gallon then to almost $4 a gallon. Just kind of overnight, the price of gas really went up. At that same time, a group of individuals had circulated a petition, and they had gotten on the ballot a proposal to raise the taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel. Okay. Now, again, history is that back when, because when Oklahoma, you got to think, when we were founded, there weren't a whole lot of cars on the road. We became a state in 1907, and there's not a lot of cars out there. The automobile industry grew at the same time Oklahoma grew. And the way that the legislature at that time, as most legislatures across the country, decided to meet the demand for roads and bridges, which if you're going to have cars, you got to have roads and bridges, was that there would be a tax on gasoline and diesel fuel. And that money went right to the transportation fund, and it was meant to build roads and bridges and maintain roads and bridges. Well, over time, starting from about the 1980s on, we never made a change in that tax. Well, as vehicles became more fuel efficient, they bought less gasoline. I mean, I can remember the first car I had in 1973. It was probably lucky if it got 10 miles to the gallon. You probably had a car like that back then. Now I think the minimum standard is 22 miles per gallon, and that standard continues to rise. So we have more cars on the road, and they're burning less gasoline, so they don't go buy gas as much. And so the tax on fuel does not generate as much revenue as it would have if the same number of cars were on the road back in 1930. And so the way to solve that was to raise the gasoline tax. Obviously, we all know that in Oklahoma we don't like taxes. I mean, and I don't know that we're different than anybody else, but we seem to be more dug in on tax increases. And so that failed, and it failed miserably. Now, I'm not sure what would have happened if we would have had Katrina. Maybe the vote would have been a little closer, I don't know. But the result of that was that the legislature came back into session and they said, our roads and bridges are really in bad shape, and we need to do something. Now, rather than themselves voting a tax increase, which they have the authority to do, and which in my opinion would have been the right thing to do, they decided to pull money off the top out of the appropriation process and dedicate it to roads. And then they would add money to that every year. So the original proposal was $30 million a year. At that time, the appropriation that roads and bridges were getting was about $160 million. So let's take that $160 million. We're going to add $30 million to it a year, every year, until it reaches $300 million. Now, when all that discussion took place, at that time we had a lot of growth in revenue in Oklahoma. Our revenue was growing $200 million a year. And so the idea was, well, we've got this base revenue, it's growing $200 million, we'll just take $30 million out of that, and we've still got $170 million to go through the appropriation process to meet other state needs. Well, unfortunately, the recession hit, and so you had in 2010, 2011, 2012, you don't really have a lot of growth in state revenue. But while other state appropriated funds were being cut, the money that went to transportation continued to go up. And so they got $30 million, and then $30 million more the next year, it became $60 million, and then $30 million more, it became $90 million more than what they had originally. 3 years ago, they raised that number to $35 million, and they were going to cap it out at $40 million. And then last year, they raised that to $59 million, and then it's going to cap out at somewhere close to $600 million. Well, so right now, you had last week when the excise board met, $59 million was pulled out of the appropriation process and put in the transportation fund before anything else happened. And then we also saw in that same meeting that revenues are going to be $139 million less than what they projected. That 139 doesn't count the 59 that was pulled off the top. The result of that has been that over the last 5 years, that funding for roads and bridges has gone up $190 million. And look, our roads and bridges in this state have been neglected. I don't think there's any doubt about that. and as a state, we need to do something about that. But again, I think that if you said to the citizens of Oklahoma, what we're going to do is we're going to increase spending on roads and bridges, and we're going to take money out of corrections so that our prison guards are going to work 60 hours a week mandatory, or we're going to take money out of DHS so we don't have money to serve the kids in the state of Oklahoma. I don't think people would have voted for that trade, and I certainly don't think they would have approved that we would cut education spending by $200 million and put that money to roads and bridges. Now, did they take $200 million out of education and put it in roads and bridges? No, they did not. There's not a dollar for dollar trade there. But what we've done is we have prioritized other departments over others, and that's part of the process. I understand that. The result of all this is before the recession hit, if you looked at all the revenue that came into the state, about 59% of that revenue went through the appropriation process. Now only 52% of state revenue goes through the appropriation process. If I were somebody that was responsible for developing the state budget, that percentage would worry me. And I think that when you look at what's happened in Washington, D.C., and the reason they're in such a stalemate is there is so much of the federal budget that the people that are voting on the budget don't control because of mandatory spending, because allocations are made to programs before it goes through the appropriation process. And I hope that I'm concerned that we're headed down that same path. And in some ways it's scary, because we have some funds that are appropriated to common education that don't go through the appropriation process. Now, most of those dollars are dollars where the taxpayers of this state have voted taxes on themselves for the purpose of it going to public education. Or they voted for a program because those revenues, the best example is the lottery. We voted in the lottery. Lottery probably would have passed anyway, but the kicker for people was, well, if you voted in the lottery, we're going to spend that money on public schools. And so there's a dedicated source of revenue that is revenue that comes into the state, but that money is spoken before it ever goes through the appropriation process. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue, and it's not a Republican-Democratic issue. You know, I think that sometimes people think that I'm criticizing the governor or criticizing current members of the legislature. I'm not. I mean, this stuff has historical precedence. But the reality is this: we've made some decisions the last few years in this state that if we had not made them, we would have more money in our school districts. The intangible tax cut that we voted on as a people passed by, I think, 65%. Common schools would have had $30 million more this year to spend if we would not have passed that tax cut. The cap on property taxes hurts public schools. State income tax cut. You know, we would have, people may remember that last couple of weeks ago, the state Supreme Court ruled the tax cut that was passed by the legislature 2 years ago was unconstitutional. If that tax cut were in place, we'd have $150 million less revenue to work with next year in the state of Oklahoma. You know, there's an appropriate time to cut taxes, but I think, again, and I've said this several times, we have obligations in this state. We ought to pay our bills. We have a law that says that we should have 20 students in elementary classrooms. We need to have enough money to put teachers in those classrooms so that we can get to that 20-to-1 ratio. We have a requirement that students pass 4 out of 7 end of instruction tests to graduate. When we did that, there was a promise there would be money to remediate those kids, to provide extra instruction for those students who did not get it the first time. We ought to fund that. If it's a requirement, we ought to fund it. And when we funded all those things, when we've got prison guards working 40 hours a week, when we've met our obligations for Medicaid and Medicare, when we've met our obligation to DHS, and when we've met our obligations to fix the roads and bridges in this state, when we've done that, then we can talk about cutting taxes. But we haven't done that. And again, that's my opinion. Not everybody may feel that way. but that's the way I feel about it.
The perception is that, you know, we're 24th biggest school district in the state, and we've had a little growth. We lose a few students, but it almost feels like our schools, our classrooms are busting at the seams.
Well,
right
we
now.
have more kids than we had 5 years ago.
Yeah.
We have grown. We're growing kids, and we've reduced teachers as we've been dealing with the effects of the recession and the fact that our state aid allocation is $2 million less than what it was. I mean, that's not just $2 million this year. It was, you know, a million something in last year, $1 million something the year before. So we've lost, you know, dollars every year. Now, again, it's not necessarily been a where we've cut, but we haven't grown as we should have because of the number of kids we had. If our enrollment were the same as it was in 2008, 2009, we wouldn't have a $2 million shortfall. But we have grown. And when you grow, the way the funding formula is supposed to work is when you grow, you're supposed to get more dollars. And so, you know, it's created an issue for us. Now, I'm glad we're growing. You know, I'd a lot rather grow than be in decline. We've been through that here too. You know, when I first came here, we were losing kids every year. And we had less money to work with than we had the year before, but that was because we lost students. And that's a lot different scenario than when you're not getting the dollars you need to fund your schools appropriately and you're growing kids at the same time. And it really is a strange place to be in, and one that I don't know that I anticipated that we'd find ourselves in, that we find ourselves in today.
And what else do you want?
Okay, what else is, so because of all this, that's why on March 31st, the Oklahoma Education Coalition, which is the groups in the state that support public schools, the Oklahoma State School Board Association, the Cooperative Council of School Administrators, the PTA, the Tulsa Public Schools, Oklahoma City Public Schools, Tulsa Classroom Teacher Association, Oklahoma City Classroom Teacher Association, Oklahoma Organization of Rural Oklahoma Schools, the group that's called the Education Coalition. That's why the coalition has come together, and they have called for a statewide rally to support public schools on March 31st. And so we changed our calendar yesterday to allow our teachers and administrators, parents, to participate in that rally. And so we will not have school March 31st.
It's a Monday. Yeah.
That's a Monday. And so we are going to be talking to our patrons, hopefully our business community, to go down and join with educators from across the state of Oklahoma at a rally at the Capitol to support our public schools. You know, we're not going to ask for a tax increase. We're not even, you know, we're not asking for $100 million or $200 million or $300 million. What we're saying is that education is, we've said continually in this state, every time the voters have been given a reasonable proposal to support their schools, they have come out in droves and they've supported that. It's time that the legislature and the governor got recommitted to public education and made that their number one priority. Not by shoving reforms down our throats they don't finance, but by financing the mandates they've put on us as school districts and providing us dollars to reduce class size and really to give our teachers and support people a pay raise. I mean, it's been 7 years. I mean, our teachers, we've had pay raises, and I want to make that clear. Every year, our support personnel and our teachers have gotten a step increase. But those are more, you know, maybe you would consider them cost of living adjustments. Mm-hmm. They're not what any of us, I think, would consider to be really pay raises. And you know, we may not be able to do it in 2014-15, but hopefully our action in Oklahoma City on March 31st will convince our leadership that for the next 4 years we need to be committed to our public schools, that needs to be the number one commitment of the state. We need to find a way to get that done. Because the bottom line is it's the greatest need that we have. It has the most dramatic, what's going to make Oklahoma better? You know, what's going to make Oklahoma better is if our public schools are better. That'll have the most long-term effect on this state and its future prosperity.
March 31st. That's going to be a big day at State Capitol.
Big day
right
at State
there.
Capitol.
Thank you, Dr. Pennington. That's this month's board wrap-up.